My name's Patsy. I'm here in colourful clothing today, but tomorrow if you're coming to Royal National Park you'll see me in uniform because that's my patch. I'm a part-time ranger for the Royal area, but I went part-time from full-time substantive position a few years ago when my kids were little and I started to get itchy feet that I wanted to do other stuff. So my other stuff includes working at the University of Wollongong. I'm the Janet Cosh Herbarium curator there, but sounds very fancy, but sometimes it's only voluntary and sometimes it's casually funded. During the pandemic, we lost funding altogether, so we're just picking that up again. There's chairs over this side if you'd like to come over.
Yeah, thanks.
I work at the uni and I teach a little bit of plant ID to students who are learning about conservation biology in their second year subjects and they need to put a herbarium together, so I run that unit. I have a bit to do and while my kids were little at the local primary school where we grew a little. We had a little environment hour and did a few things together there and built a swamp oak floodplain forest and just talked to them about native plants and connections and corridors and the like. I work as a volunteer myself. So how many of you are volunteers in different things? Oh, everybody. Does anyone actually get paid for conservation in the room? Yay! So there's two of us who get a little bit of money. Not much. Enough to sort of say, oh, I'm a professional. So that's great that there's a little bit of money coming down to people employed. And I'm teaching these uni students to build up some professional skills because hopefully one day things will change. But they do get jobs as ecological consultants and they don't know much at all about anything. So it's a bit scary. So I work in community nurseries and some of you might as well. If you're members of the Australian Plant Society, then sure as eggs you've got some connection with some community group or some community nursery where you're putting plants out there either in your own gardens or in other spaces. So there's a lot going on in conservation and I changed the topic. I don't know if anyone noticed that I changed it to models of plant conservation rather than just conservation because that's a big, big topic. But I'd just like to say that plants are intrinsically wonderful, as we all agree. That's why we're here. So for flora on their own, they have value, but flora is also a surrogate for habitat for fauna. So we can't just focus on a single species or a community of plants or veg type. We need to consider it as habitat for other creatures, and we need those other creatures to pollinate and to seed disperse. And also from what Clarence, who was here yesterday and heard Clarence speaking, he was talking about totemic species, that his family groupings, they might have a totem that represents a whole community, and in ecological scientific terms that's called umbrella species. So a lot of the conservation decision makers focus on umbrella species that represent a much wider community. So the powerful owl or koala or whatever, that if you're protecting the koala or the powerful owl, you are therefore protecting a whole stack of other species that they either eat or have some relationship with as far as their habitat, trees and roost spaces and the like. So when I started with National Parks yonks ago, I worked as a technical officer for fire ecology and we were looking at rare or threatened Australian plants and what their fire threshold was. So we're looking at things like Eucalyptus lumaniana and Darwinia diminuta and other species that were getting threatened because of too frequent or too intense fires. So all that work back then has come to the fore now, really, because all of what we found out back then about doing germination trials on different wattles and the like has fed into fire management strategies, and that becomes the fire frequency that national parks and RFS and various other fire and land managers use to govern the frequency of burning different types of veg. So we can all have a hand in little research projects, either as citizen scientists and filling in some of the information data gaps that Scott Mooney and David Keith also mentioned yesterday that are important. So today's talk, that's a very long introduction on my part, but today's talk is about models of conservation. So what is a model? And I think those guys who were speaking to us yesterday also, and I took a mental note of it, that they all said that models invariably don't work. That 1 + 1 very rarely equals 2. because there's a whole lot of other things at play, that we either underestimate the resilience of plants, or we overestimate how much money we're going to get from the federal government in support of this bit of research or conservation action. So there's the structure or the framework or the focus or the legislation that is in place that's focusing on threatened species or whatever it is. And then there's something happens between there and whether it gets onto on-ground practice. And that bit in the middle, there's a whole lot of things that are going on in the middle between there and there. And we often sit in that middle ground. So we are the uncodified experts. And I have a friend who's a coastal geomorphologist who does modelling on those big scales for those big coastal processes. And I spoke to him about giving this talk and calling it Models of Conservation and thinking, well, if he knows anything about models, he can tell me. So he basically said, yes, what you're talking about is a practical model. That if you want a practical model to work, you need to have your structure and your focus and your framework in place, but you need to factor in this uncodified expertise, and that's us. All the knowledge that we have from our walks of life and our knowledge input and our meticulous work that we're doing on germination trials and propagation and fire ephemeral species that we're working on in different community nurseries, helping out with researchers at the Mount Annan Botanic Gardens or having something to do with Glossies in the Mist, Saving Our Species projects. All these little actions and the knowledges and the failures and the challenges and the opportunities that we have and create and find, we can feed that back up the line or across the line to each other so that we can actually make things work. That's what needs to be factored into a framework that's legislative. So I want to start there. I want to start at the international level. We have the Iucn, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They talk about, they've created a list, or a red list it's called, of species that have their status determined as in one form or another of threatened impact. So unfortunately there's a whole lot of extinct species on this Iucn red list, but there's critically endangered, vulnerable, or ones that are protected in conservation areas or protected areas. And there's other ones that are called data deficient. So we don't know. The answer that they're classified as I don't know because there's not enough information to make a call on their status. We can be part of that I don't know data gap filling process. And a lot of the projects that I just mentioned that I've been dabbling in over the years have fed into some of that data gap filling, and it's quite exciting. I think Dan, who's just walked in, has been part of that with a protected plant that grows in Royal National Park, the Prostanthera densa. So by going out and doing regular surveys and building up this data set, we can sort of fill in some of those gaps and have a better understanding of what a particular species might need in its environment, what are the pressures it's under. But it's not just for that species. That species might represent a whole section of the flora that might respond a certain way to fire, or might respond a certain way to deer grazing, or might respond to salt winds or whatever. So it might just be focused on one species, but we can extrapolate to another. Might be focused on a threatened ecological community, but you can extrapolate that further. So often try to have a look at the work that you do as a volunteer and see if you can extrapolate it beyond your application. What you do might inform the next creek catchment. It might inform other vegetation types that are similar to the ones that you're working on, and vice versa. They might have found that certain things work there that you can emulate in your space. So where was I going with that? I don't know.
But
that's all right.
How would you link up with that? I'm thinking, I work locally, perhaps a little bit in the region.
Yep.
So where would you find that, somebody who's been doing the same thing? Is it, I'm a land carer, what?
Ask your land care coordinator. They will know another land care coordinator that's working in a similar space to you. You can talk to any of your local government natural areas officers, and they speak to each other. They're in a network amongst themselves. They've got bush care sites coming out their ears and volunteers with a whole stack of knowledge So they can form networks and go, you need to speak to so-and-so and so-and-so because they've got a similar creek line to you, and you're actually coming from the same catchment source, maybe you've got the same issues, and you can actually head off the problem back up here, higher in the catchment. So yeah, they can link you up. So I was at the Iucn, I was at the international level up here where the Iucn creating that international list for us, but they also define what a protected area is. Where you work at the moment in your voluntary capacities, have a think about whether that parcel of land is protected, whether it fits into this definition. A clearly defined geographic space, recognised, dedicated and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve long-term conservation. Long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services in place and cultural values. So, getting back to Clarence again, the cultural values part of it, remember that plants are intrinsically wonderful in themselves, that they represent habitat for fauna, but they are also, as part of they have a cultural role as food, fibre, medicine and ceremony. They are very much a part of the cultural heritage of our nation here, and we're very lucky that we have such an amazing cultural base of knowledge that the Indigenous Aboriginal people of Australia are imagining and reworking and reawakening in themselves and teaching us about that, and that's what Clarence was sort of referring to yesterday. So in all of these activities we can factor in that cultural aspect. Even not just Aboriginal culture, but I remember working in a creek line up the back of Byron Creek, which is just inland from Wollongong, and I was taking out this cestrum that was there. If anyone knows cestrum, it's in the Solanaceae and it's a bit of an invasive plant. There's other solanums that it relates to, but I thought, I've got to get rid of this cestrum, so I got my loppers out and I chopped it, and this Italian guy bowled out of the back of his yard and said, "What are you doing? That's my night-scented jessamine that I planted for my mother and I brought it from Italy and da-da-da." And I just thought, I hadn't put herbicide on it, which was great because I said, okay, it'll grow back. But he was fuming with me. But I took that away with me and thought, I've got to actually be a little bit more careful, I think, especially in sort of suburban spaces where there's a whole lot of different user groups who are using that same patch. I can't assume it's a national park, that it's going to be a botanically pure veg type. There are people who love this space and you need to respect that as well. If it's not an invasive, and it wasn't Cestrum parkii, it was another Cestrum nocturnum, I think it's called. So I probably should have left it. It was a night-scented jessamine or jasmine, and I could have quite happily left it because it didn't have that same invasive potential. So be careful what you know, that you're not thinking you're a smart ass that you know what it is and not because I've got it wrong. So yeah, you just have to second guess yourself sometimes from a cultural theme perspective. So I've only got to the international level. From that IUCN Red List, each of our nations take that set of priorities away, and in Australia, the EPBC Act, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, also uses that same language from the IUCN, where that bit of legislation forms a framework for the whole of Australia that we also use right down to local level. We talk about threatened species and critically endangered and vulnerable, and things are classified according to that. And there's various species profiles or threatened ecological community profiles with species lists and assemblages and recommended practices and fire regimes and a whole lot of information behind that strategy and classification system. So we've got these structures that we all work within. So you might not have a threatened species on your block, but you may have umbrella species that, if you have that overarching tree species that therefore creates habitat and space and food and fodder and habitat for other creatures and other species, then that's how you have to start to think in that sort of catalytic way, that if you have a structure in place, then the biodiversity can have something to hang off and to live off and to engage with. So the EPBC Act then informs the state government agencies like National Parks and Wildlife Service, like Local Land Services that co-funds a lot of our projects on park, that also co-funds bioregional catchment-based projects. They used to be the Catchment Management Authority, they used to be Soil Conservice, they used to be Crown Lands Office, and it's all been bundled under Local Land Services. If anyone's had anything to do with LLS, it's a really big department. They've got fingers in lots of pies. Also at a state level, the Biodiversity Conservation Act is another piece of legislation or codified expertise that informs us in this model arrangement for conservation. And the Biodiversity Conservation Act created the Biodiversity Conservation Trust to enact that act in 2016. So since then, the BCT, Biodiversity Conservation Trust, has fingers in pies to support private landholders to extend this protected area and national reserve system onto private land, as well as to support what's happening on public conserved areas. So if you're a private landholder, I've been out to a dairy farm in Camden at Brownlow Hill, 23 hectares, hardly anything, but they've got Cumberland plain woodland species there. They've got an assemblage of species that are weed affected. There's a lot of African olive and there's deer that graze through there. So they get money for fencing, weed control, pest species control and publicity. They get a sign up, they talk to their neighbours about it, they try to talk to their catchment neighbours and to build that set of agreements and conservation perspectives with their neighbours. And they get $113 per hectare per year. So for 23 hectares, that works out to be, I don't know, 25,000 a year or something. So I don't know how often they get that, but at that time they were getting it yearly. So it's worthwhile. I mean, that's not a lot of money when it comes to contract bush regen work or fencing or deer control or whatever, but it's something and it helps that private landholder. And I know as a taxpayer, I would rather my money go through to that sort of application. Quite happy to support that, and I'm sure other people feel like that as well. There's a lot of problem with the offset scheme. There's talk now that there's a biodiversity offset scheme and carbon credits and all the like, and it's quite contentious. There's a few articles along the back fence, the back table there that you might want to have a look at about that. But I looked on a Facebook page just the other day and I was very conscious of the topic that we're talking about today is a present day topic, and this was just the other day that one of the people who work at the Botanic Gardens, but I just know her privately, she was on this Facebook page and she said, just individually, not as a professional, but said what we need is a biodiversity offset scheme that protects and enhances natural vegetation, like money for weed and feral animal control, research and education into sustainable grazing, and the promotion of community engagement with the environment. And there was a lot of feeling about what she was saying with that. It all stemmed off, that was 2 days ago or 2 days after Tanya Plibersek at federal government level announced the biodiversity offset scheme. So instantly we're all going, not another bloody scheme, but hopefully we can protect what's already there. Let's stop the clearing and look after the quality and quantity of what we have now and hopefully enhance that. So there's a lot of contention about the Biodiversity Conservation Trust and the offset schemes that they manage, that there's too much development still buying into clearing, and that there's not enough getting down on the ground to protect like-for-like vegetation types. And does like-for-like vegetation types even exist? So if you're clearing Cumberland Plain woodland, where are you going to find a bit of Cumberland Plain woodland to offset? There's a discrepancy. So there's a bit of discussion there that we all need to have, and we need to scream about it. If you're opposed to it, don't hold back, because the politicians need to hear. So, protected areas. I talked about Iucn and the EPBC Act at that federal level, state level, and I was getting down to councils. councils have local environment plans and development control plans and zonings that protect certain parcels of land as environmental protection, and it's on those parcels usually that bush care sites operate, and volunteers like ourselves work on under the guidance, hopefully, if we're lucky, to have a natural areas officer guiding or steering us, or people within that group with some sort of ecological understanding and knowledge, or linked to other tertiary institutions or LLS expertise or whoever to steer that sort of work. We've got a great body in the Noxious Weeds Authority in this part of the Illawarra. They've got a lot of pressure on them and a lot of work to get rid of some weeds and feral animals. So supporting them and vice versa, them supporting us in our little patches is great as well. But, the last group that we had when we started, we were really stuck on this, how much of it is our responsibility at an individual level. I think we all want to have some sort of effective work. We don't want to waste our time in getting rid of a whole lot of lantana that's going to be back next week. If we want to try to link in with good practices elsewhere, and we want our work to be valued and we want our work to be sustainable. So it's better to work, I think, within these structures and within the protected National Reserve system where we can. But if you've got a private bush block and it doesn't have a enduring covenant on it, or say if it does have an enduring covenant on it, then it's basically as protected as a national park is. But if it doesn't have it, then the next owner can just come and remove it. So,
just a question about that. I have that. I have a 5-acre regenerating rainforest block up in northern New South Wales, and I would like to put an enduring covenant on it, but it's too small, I understand, for the current legislation.
It is.
So where does that leave people who, there may be a lot of people in an area who've got remnant and regenerating small holdings.
Maybe there's an opportunity that either local government or LLS can put your piece together with the other people around and have a bit of a bigger protected area that's somehow combined.
That would be ideal because, to be realistic, that's more like what there is out there, smaller. I can't remember.
We used to have catchment management authorities and the catchment management committees, which used to focus on small grants for certain little pockets of things, but then would link you up together. And there's a small farms network as well, and the land care movement also. They're focusing on small, isolated, fragmented farm pockets of particular veg types that I would be approaching one of those people and just say, how can I ask that question to them in your area?
Yes.
How can I link my good bit with these other people's good bits, and we can come up with something that is big enough for BCT to form an agreement. I did hear from someone else that you can actually get, maybe it's per council, maybe there's some sort of opportunities within your local government area where they do protective things, where they can actually change the zoning of part of your land. So there's possibilities. You could ask those questions at an LGA level.
Yes, I think so, because I think it's, whatever the current hectares is, it's many more than even just my neighbours around me.
Yeah,
we can all add up
20
to
hectares.
It's
20.
And I think it's 40 unless it's a threatened ecological community.
Yeah,
then
right.
you can reduce it down to 20.
Well, there are
Plants and threatened
koalas.
places.
There are koalas there. I heard one last month.
Okay.
Is it different by state though? Are you talking about New South Wales? Yeah, so there's even variations per state.
Yeah.
Well, if any of you listened to the news a few months ago now, or might have only been weeks, but when the State of the Environment report came out, there was a lot of talk. I was listening to Radio National on my way to somewhere, and they were basically summarising the outcomes of this State of the Environment report, but they basically said that there was this great litany of things that are wrong in the environmental framework management system across the nation, and one of them was that inconsistencies between local, state, federal initiatives, and that we've got to get harder in each of those, decision making and punitive measures to people who are clearing unlawfully and all of those things, that we're all just too soft. Us conservationists need to be, tougher and, be a bit more lobbying and to put that back in the face of the politicians and say, this council's doing a fantastic job. You are not doing a fantastic job. Can you raise the hectareage can you reduce the hectareage of what is entitled, who is entitled to join these initiatives? Can you please facilitate that? And I will vote for you at the next election. Just really put it in really brazen terms that they will understand and hear. So I think there's a role for us to lobby, to talk about what we're doing and to say they're doing a good job, please mimic it.
Well, in the Tweed Shire, there's certainly biodiversity funding right down to the size of 2 hectares, which is what I've got. And so that's good for the here and now, for people that are sort of trying to do things now. But if you're concerned about beyond your lifetime what's going to happen to that, you really do need what you were suggesting before, is people to actually have the capacity within the legal framework to be able to link together like-minded property.
And I think you're not alone in that, and I think there's strength in that as well. I mean, it's sad that you're not alone, but there's strength in it as well. So there is an opportunity to link in and maybe use whatever social media communication modes you have and put it out there that this is your situation, who else is there, what can we do about it locally, what can we do about it from a catchment perspective. Good on you. So some of the challenges and that various people have mentioned, that we've got these information data gaps that we can try to fill. We can assist with some research and survey. Time is both an opportunity and a challenge. Maybe we don't have enough time, or maybe time's moving too fast or too slow for us. So we can use time for as a plus or a minus. Climate change, similarly, I think Scott Mooney yesterday showed us that there are natural climatic change cycles, but we need to tease out which of those climatic changes is human-induced, that we can try to slow that down and try to tease that out as to what are we doing wrong in society, and try to stop clearing or stop pollution or make a bit of a song and dance. Just today, the NPA have put it back up to the EPA to clean up the Hacking River because of pollution from the Metropolitan Colliery at Helensburgh. So that sort of vocalisation of issues in the community need to be done a lot more. Fragmentation and clearing. So I've got a little example here in these triptych 3 pictures here. So this house block here, I've got permission from the owner because I'm the owner. This is my home. I've got backyard trees, I've got front yard trees and sideway. My neighbour hates trees, so she hasn't got anything. But what I've done here is that I have linked in my place, which is in the middle here, with other trees and creek lines around here to think, well, how significant is my place relative to whatever else there is around? And from a bigger spot, that's me there, how am I linking between the escarpment and the sea, that I'm on this sort of creek line corridor? I'm putting myself in context, in a landscape context. If we all know where we are from a landscape context, it really helps us have that view that we're part of something bigger and that what I do is significant and catalytic to something else. So I'm a bit of a stopgap, and I do birds in backyards, surveys and stuff. So I know I get rainforest birds here, I get coastal birds here because I'm halfway between. And it's really quite, it just makes you feel more connected to a place, because you are connected to a place. It doesn't just make you feel connected, you actually are, whether you know it or not. So that sort of understanding I find quite useful, and that reducing fragmentation is the physical fragmentation. So this little patch of vegetation down here is not connected to your bigger patch of vegetation. Maybe we need to build up this bit in between to link it there, to link it to you there, so that those plants and the animals living there have got somewhere to go. You're giving them a path because there's a 6-lane highway here and they can't get across it. And there's some sort of wildlife corridor over here that I can build up and link you with them and them with you. So think about that in terms of your own private spaces. Some of the other pictures I've got here just to spur some thoughts and discussions. Menai Wildflower Group nursery growing trees for glossy-tailed black cockatoo habitat. National Park volunteers pulling out crofton weed and lantana and asparagus fern in an asset protection zone at Bundina. Planting next to a little picnic area and building up that edge and weeding. That's at Kelly's Falls at Helensburgh. Collecting seeds. Callistemon and melaleucas are pretty easy to collect because they just dry out and they open their seed. But other things are a bit more difficult to get out of the seed, and learning what is a seed. We're trying to figure out in this Angophora hispida which part's the seed, and we're processing it, and do we have to soak it in hydrochloric acid or feed it to a bird, or what do we have to do? Growing koala fodder trees. So these are all Eucalyptus punctatus that we got grown at Menai Wildflower Group. There's the Glossies casuarinas. Rotary have a Adopt a Tree program where urban dwellers can buy trees and go and plant trees on farms, and they're all linked through the bioregional boundaries of local land services, and the BCT supports what these guys are doing, so it all feeds into that same framework and model that we were talking about. And they're growing wattles, and they don't even name them. This is acacia number 6 for moorlands. It doesn't matter what it's called. The plant doesn't know what it's called, so don't feel too bad if you don't know what things are called. Don't let that get in the way of helping, because someone hopefully knows what it's called somewhere, if it is important to name it. But if you know that that seed was growing there in the natural community and you're just wanting to enhance it, just collect some seed, grow it on, take it back there. You don't have to call it anything. You can call it acacia number 6, that's fine. These guys are working in a threatened ecological community, a riverside littoral rainforest community with me, planting some casuarina glaucus. Some researchers from a private, that's Australian Wildlife Conservancy, biologists, botanists, and doing some veg surveying and monitoring. People doing plant ID courses and getting out on the field and discussing issues. So you might be a landholder and you're not quite sure what's going on in your place, but you know it's getting hammered by weeds, or it's getting hammered, there's foxes or there's deer or whatever. You're going to call somebody to come and help you. Come and help me discuss the issues here. Give me a little job list of what I need to do as a landholder. Give me some financial support through one of these schemes. Yeah, so just reaching out. So some of the verbs and adjectives we've got in here are stop clearing, develop situational awareness, link in, fill data deficiencies, help landholders and land managers, focus on umbrella species or communities. I don't know if I mentioned it there, I didn't talk about umbrella species, rather than single species. But if you do focus on single species, just consider what that single species needs. We might not know exactly, but the more we sort of learn about things, then maybe that could represent. So if you're looking at the pink flannel flowers as a fire ephemeral, that we know it comes back after fire because it got hammered in 2019, 2020, and it's just going off its head all through Moulton National Park, and it gets triggered and then it dies away for ages. We don't see it for ages. It represents a whole lot of other fire ephemeral species that are doing the same sort of strategy. So just because you're working on one little species, it can actually inform a whole research and consider cultural values and pollinators and seed dispersal agents. That's another topic in itself which I won't go to.
If you enjoyed this presentation, then please subscribe to our channel. Other presentations from the conference are available in this playlist, with new ones being added all the time.